As we continue to look at Mark under the title of Proclamation and Opposition, we are going to this week look at the final three pericopes or stories of examples of Jesus facing persecution. They are found in Mark 2, starting in verse 18 and going through to Mark 3, verse 6. The first story that we're going to look at is Jesus being questioned about fasting, found in Mark 2, verses 18 to 22. All the synoptic gospels have this event following the call of Levi or Matthew. And we learn a little bit of the story a little bit differently from each of the Gospels. In Matthew, we learn that the people asking about why Jesus' disciples weren't fasting were all actually followers of John the Baptist. In Luke, we have the added comment that for those who had tried the old wine, they like it better. But when we look at the actual event that took place, it begins first of all with Jesus being questioned by some people, and as I said already, from Matthew we know that they were disciples of John's. Why the Pharisees and the disciples of John fasted, but Jesus' disciples didn't fast. And Jesus gives three responses to this, all kind of word pictures. The first is a picture of a bridegroom. Now, wedding ceremonies and celebrations are large all over the world. They were certainly a joyous celebration in Israel. And so Jesus questioned, how could his disciples fast when the bridegroom was with him? And he's referring to himself, saying that this time is a time of joy, and so they would not be fasting now. But he adds this kind of cryptic note that when the bridegroom is taken away from them, then they will fast. And this strikes me as a little bit of a foreshadowing of Jesus' death. That may not be the case, but it certainly could be, and it's certainly one way of understanding that passage. The next example Jesus uses is that of a patch. And he says, you don't put a new patch on an old garment, because then when the new patch shrinks, of course, you will tear the old garment. And finally, he uses the example of not to put new wine in an old wineskin, because then the old wineskin will not stretch and it will burst. And if you don't know or aren't aware, in Jesus' day, wineskins were made out of animal hide. And so when you had a fresh hide and you put the wine in there, the hide could stretch. But once that process had taken place and you had an old wineskin, it could no longer stretch. And so if you put new wine in an old wineskin, of course, it would burst and be destroyed. And so these last two examples have a similar message. And it stresses the need to be open to God and to be flexible. The comment in Luke suggests that if we are not open, and we can easily become comfortable with the old way of doing things, and as a result miss the new gift that's being offered in Christ. While Matthew has the next story a little bit later, all three accounts are quite similar. Jesus' question about his disciples harvesting grain on the Sabbath or gleaning on the Sabbath. According to Old Testament law, an individual or people were allowed to, as they walked by a neighbor's field, glean the edge of the field. They were allowed to take some heads of grain in their hand and eat them. They were not allowed to actually take a tool to harvest the grain, but they were allowed to glean it. And this was especially important for poor people, as that was a major source of food for them. So what the Pharisees are opposing Jesus doing is doing this on the Sabbath, because they considered even taking those grains in their hands and rubbing them to be work. And so that is the accusation that the Pharisees level against Jesus. Jesus comes back with the story of David while he was on the run from Saul, coming and taking the sacred bread from the tabernacle and eating it and giving some to his friends. The emphasis in each of the synoptic gospels is somewhat different, or maybe a little bit more involved with some. So Matthew's account is most involved, and he uses this story, and then he says, comparing that to what Jesus had been just doing, Jesus claims that if the sacred bread could be taken out of the tabernacle and given to David's men, and the priests could do that work on the Sabbath and not be condemned, how much more so could Jesus' followers do this gleaning on the Sabbath? Because while the work that needed to be done in the temple was important and therefore was allowed on the Sabbath by the priests, how much more so now that one greater than the temple, Jesus Christ, was here. And so the argument's quite a bit more involved in Matthew, but it makes the point that Jesus is greater than the temple, which is quite the claim. And it also ties him to being the son of David, the Messiah, and thirdly, in Matthew's account, we have the Old Testament reference again of Hosea 6:6 saying, you misunderstand the law here, because as we've already seen, God desires mercy, not sacrifice. So the priests, the Pharisees were making mistakes on multiple levels. First of all, Jesus was Lord of the Sabbath because he was the son of David. Jesus also covered their work on the Sabbath, because if work in the temple could be justified on the Sabbath, how much more so, since Jesus was greater than the temple, how much more so could his disciples, in a sense the new priests, be justified in doing work on the Sabbath? In Luke, the emphasis is more directly to Jesus being the son of David, the son of man, and therefore the son of David. And if the son of David could take the bread out of the temple, how much more so could his disciples take grain from the field on the Sabbath day? Mark gives us more detail in that he mentions the high priest by name. The challenge is that the name he mentions is Abiathar, and Abiathar was the son of Ahimelech, but Ahimelech was the one who actually provided the food for David, not his son who would rule later. The NIV gets around this by translating the word when as in the days of, so that it makes it broader and gets around the conflict that way. But this is a very difficult passage in the Greek, and there's not enough time to go into all the different theories about how this can be solved. But the NIV chooses the route of translating when as in the days of. And so then it's not saying that Abiathar was the one who gave David the bread, but it was during that age and that time. And then Mark states one more thing that the other Gospels leave out, and that is this statement of Jesus that the Sabbath was made for man and not man for the Sabbath. And then goes on to say, so the Son of Man is Lord even of the Sabbath. In other words, because Jesus is the King of the world, he is over the Sabbath. But it also places this idea, and it's an important one, that God gave the Sabbath as a gift to men, not as a burden. It was meant to assist us as human beings to be intentional about resting and focusing on Him. And so it was a gift that was to be enjoyed, not a burden to be carried. And the last of the 5 stories is the healing of the man with the shriveled hand. Again, this revolves around the Sabbath. The healing took place on the Sabbath. That was what the Pharisees were opposed to. And we know from Luke that it was on another Sabbath, which tells us that there's no chronological connection again. The authors are just putting these stories together because they have a similar content. And the actual surroundings are Jesus is in the synagogue. The Pharisees are watching him to see if he is going to heal this person on the Sabbath. And rather than just do it quietly, Jesus, knowing what they're thinking, tells this man with a shriveled right hand, as we learn from Luke 6:6, and he challenges the Pharisees and says in Mark, is it unlawful to do good on the Sabbath? And in Matthew's gospel, he adds a little story, and he says, like, which one of you, if you had a sheep fall in a pit, would you not help that sheep? How much more so should we not help a fellow human being who is sick? And so Jesus does not back down from this challenge. Jesus does not hide. Rather, he puts the man on full display and confronts them, challenges them in what they're thinking. And Mark is unique in telling us that Jesus was angry. When he first saw the response of the Pharisees, he was angry because they wouldn't answer him. Clearly, they were opposed to Jesus healing this man on the Sabbath. And then the ongoing emotion that Jesus feels is distress. He's deeply distressed. So there's a momentary anger, and we know this from the tense in the Greek that it is past, it's happened, but when the emotion of being in deep distress is given, it's given in an ongoing tense. So he continued to be distressed about their stubborn hearts. and that was a source of his emotions. And the end result in each case, in each of the Gospels, was anger and questioning among themselves what they were going to do with this Jesus who clearly was not following the law. Luke leaves it there. Matthew and in our Gospel of Mark, they both say that the Pharisees start to consider how they might kill Jesus. And in Mark 2, we have the added group, the Herodians. The Herodians were not an official group of people, but they clearly had sympathies with the ruling Herodian king. And so they were probably worried about the attention that Jesus was drawing, and they did not want to get into conflict with Rome and wanted to do away with Jesus because he was causing upheaval in the Jewish community. So what we see in each of these stories is that Jesus knew wine, a new covenant or renewed covenant with the people by his reign, was coming in direct conflict with the religious authorities. And this is climaxed in this final story, where it is stated explicitly in Mark that the Pharisees and Herodians are now planning to kill Jesus.